Welcome to our marriage webinar on vulnerability in marriage. I am joined with Caleb Beyer from our office here. He is our marriage and family therapist. And I am joined by Katie Miller, also from our office. She is one of our teachers. And in full disclosure, she also happens to be my wife. So we have the joy to work together in multiple settings here at ACCFS. My name is Arlen Miller, and we're going to walk through this important topic together. Thanks for being with us. Now, let's just start off with this question. Okay, this topic probably seems like a no-brainer. Of course, we want to talk about vulnerability. Vulnerability seems like a good idea. What is vulnerability? What is vulnerability? Katie, we'll start with you. Help us understand this. How would you describe this idea of vulnerability in marriage?
Yeah, I would say when I think about vulnerability just individually before I get to the marriage relationship, I would say vulnerability is I want people to be vulnerable with me, and yet reciprocating that to someone else is really tricky. So in Katie Miller's definition, vulnerability is hard, it's not comfortable, and it's going to show my flaws. Dictionary.com's definition is up there in the screen in front of you about showing emotion or allowing one's weaknesses to be seen or known. And so when I think of relationships or I think of individually, yes, I want people to be vulnerable with me. I want them to be truly who they are. And yet that's really hard for me as a person to think about, showing my weaknesses, showing those emotions that show really my true heart and nature and who I am. When you take it into a marriage relationship, it's an even more intimate and more committed depth. And I think what Caleb and I will hopefully, and Arlen will show you today or help you teach through some of these concepts, is some of those weaknesses can actually be for the better.
Sure. So there's a level of exposure here, right? We're talking about how well do we know each other, show emotion and allows one weakness to be seen and known. It's easier maybe to hide beneath the surface. But when we talk about that intimate relationship of marriage, that becomes a really interesting scenario if you find yourself hiding or not open. But Caleb, I suppose there's a level that can go too far with vulnerability, or I suppose there's things that we might think are vulnerability, but maybe aren't. Can you shine some light on that? What is vulnerability not? Or any thoughts in that area?
Sure. So yeah, so we wouldn't say that vulnerability is letting go of healthy, realistic relationship expectations that maintain a level of safety within the relationship. And so vulnerability isn't, the purpose of vulnerability ultimately is deeper connection. And so it's not even, in some sense, I would say that even as we look at broader, culture, in some ways, vulnerability can be used in some ways as a purpose to bring praise to self, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And really what we're talking about vulnerability here, healthy vulnerability, the purpose is actually deeper connection but it's not giving up. It's not giving up important aspects of boundaries, healthy boundaries within relationship, within the marriage specifically. So it's not saying, oh, be okay with someone, yelling at you, for example.
Because they're just being vulnerable, or they're just being honest and real, right? That's not appropriate.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would say the other thing, Arlen, that comes here, I think is just really helpful to make a distinction, is to say, as Katie was talking about it, we are vulnerable. So vulnerability is accepting what we already are. I mean, just think about in Adam and Eve in Garden of Eden, right? But it's not a weakness. It's rather accepting the weakness that's already there. So vulnerability is not weakness. And sometimes it can feel that way, or we have that perception that it is.
Yeah. That definition speaks to that, Cable. It's not a weakness is a weakness, but it's a vulnerability is allowing that to be seen or to be known. And so that's kind of going to be the preface going into today's content, I would say. That's a very good point.
Yep. And I really like what you said there. I think that's a critical piece. It should lead towards connection, right? So vulnerability leads towards connection, kind of a little bit. It's not selfish in nature it is selfless in nature, willing to kind of remove maybe, I mean, there's some pride and some ego that could be there that keeps us from being vulnerable. It's willing to remove that, to lose ourselves in the sake or for the name of greater connection with someone else. Now, specifically, we're talking about with our spouse here in this context. Yeah. So Katie, this is a graphic that we've used before.
Yeah,
It's
so
got
you're
different aspects here. You want to speak a little bit to this graphic, how we're
sure.
going to
So
walk through it?
this graphic was kind of created with a multiple of ways. Obviously, you're looking at 4 words that throughout the next several minutes we will go through. Now, these 4 words are not meant to be all inclusive. Like, to be vulnerable, these 4 are present, and I've got true vulnerability. Okay, these are just 4 components that we feel to be vulnerable in a healthy way in a marriage relationship probably need to be present. And you'll notice the diagram there's a lot of overlapping. So as we go into some of these content areas, what trust means and safety, it's going to overlap, and what no means and consistent, it's going to overlap. So but these are just kind of 4 components that hopefully, as you think about vulnerability in your own marriage, that at one time or another probably need to be present or utilized in order to be truly vulnerable in a marriage in a healthy way.
I appreciate that. And that'll be kind of our outline today, is we'll walk through each of these, talk about what they are not, maybe a few examples to go along. But to your point, this isn't an exhaustive list. And it isn't like, okay, if I check off all 4 of these, then I equal vulnerability, right? I pass the class. These are things that should be kind of, that are components of it. Maybe that's a way to say it. Let's walk into the first one and just kind of think about it. Caleb, I'll look to you. Let me set it up. But this first one is this idea of knowing, right? So to be vulnerable, it's kind of in the definition that we talked about there. There's a knowing that takes place. So think about what it means to know your spouse. And then for each of these, we kind of have some opposites. So to not know your spouse is, to be in this place of vagueness or being unfamiliar. So it begs that question of how well do you know your spouse, and why is this important, right? So Caleb, why is this important for vulnerability, this aspect of knowing?
Yeah. So there's 2 aspects, even as I think about these characteristics that we're going through, and I think Katie referenced it at the outset, is both. There is a knowing of self and there's a knowing of other. And I think they go together. And even as we walk through these components, there is both a sense, as we think about knowing, yes, it's knowing our spouse, but the beauty of vulnerability, I think, is that it also leads, done well, to knowing ourselves better, right? Relationally. And so it's a both and. And so as far as knowing our spouse, it is the way of connecting. If I don't, know about what they enjoy, they like, what is on their heart related to stresses or difficult relationships in their lives, it's difficult to connect deeply with them and be at a place that I can be responsive in a way that they know I'm with them, right? I care. I'm interested in their lives, that sort of thing.
Sure.
There's a marital researcher, John Gottman, and he talks about, we have cognitive maps and a part of our brain that's specifically for the purpose of our spouse. And we build those maps over time, which is really about updating our knowing of our spouse, right? As you think about territory, we don't pull out paper maps anymore. We go to, GPS.
Yeah, go to Google, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But you're identifying the territory, and specifically for us who are married, we have parts of our brain that are specifically for knowing. It is a way of connecting with our spouse, even when they're not physically present.
And
So
I'm
Go ahead,
guessing, Caleb, that researcher Gottman would also reference, how you knew your spouse. And we'll get into some more specific levels here in a second, but how you knew your spouse. So all of you take a moment, whether you were living in the same community or grew up together or completely didn't know your spouse, how you started your marriage and knowing each other is at a very different level of, 15, 16, 20, 40 plus years
Mhm.
in. And I'm guessing what they cared about when you were newly engaged 5 years in, 10 years in, is a very different no than when you're 20 plus, 40 plus years in. And so just being aware of that, I'm guessing Gottman would also say, use that roadmap, those grooves and so forth. That map is going to change, and don't just assume through life that knowing your spouse exactly when we were engaged is the exact same, 10 plus years in.
So it's not like okay, I checked this off my list. Okay, I've gone through, here's my 20 questions to know my spouse. And once I've got those done, I've checked it off, and that's never going to change because things shift. It's a little bit of a moving target. Now, there can be intentional ways to do some of that. I mean, I'm guessing, just what do you like, or what don't you like, or how did you feel when this kind of thing happened? I mean, there's some basic questions to be curious and available to ask. But to your point, Katie, that shifts over time. It's just life experiences shift us. It's more of a process than a destination.
Yeah.
Sure. And in it makes me think about like knowing it, like you're saying, over time, Katie, is like living life with is deeply known, even as believers. Knowing Christ is I think daily, what would Christ do in the situation? How would that be reflected? And I think the same is true when you know your spouse through transitions and things that come up, losses, challenges, joys, that at a deeper than a cognitive level, right?
Absolutely.
You know how they'll respond in certain situations.
Yeah.
I think if you look at this graph, it speaks exactly what you're talking about, Caleb, right? This is a graph we've used different times in different settings, but there's levels of knowing. So on the left-hand side, you see this idea of facts. What's your favorite food? What's your favorite restaurant? All the way down through, I think, I hurt, and then this is who I am. And there's time and vulnerability that takes place to get to those deeper levels. And I think I hurt, this is who I am. This is who I am shifts over time by the experiences that shape us. Is that a fair statement, Caleb? Speak to this. How would you use this or think about this context in this realm of knowing?
Yeah. So it just moving from, like we alluded to early in the relationship, it is a lot of, what do you like? What do you not like? All the facts, right? I know about someone, or you can know about someone, but you don't really, quote unquote, know them. And so as it deepens, certainly to this is who I am. And like you said, I mean, my thoughts go to, as a father, if you were to ask me when I was first married, what would come up for me? Yes, I can predict that, but until I'm in that role, I don't really know what that is like for me. And so I'm sharing that experience live with my spouse, Ange, right? That gets to know me in the role of a father. Does that make sense? There's a life experiences that bring out in me, whether it's desires, longings, fears, that is a result of life, that they come out, and she has the opportunity, and I have the opportunity to know ourselves more deeply as a result of that, but also know each other and share in each other's, who they are.
I think two pitfalls that possibly can happen looking at this graph when I think of marriage and just my own self and vulnerability for the no piece. Two pitfalls can be, we have to stay, I hear we have to stay in the facts. There's schedules, there's logistics, there's, the kids have to be here, and, Arlen's schedule is here, and all of these things. And I think as time goes on, I think it's one of the pitfalls can be is we just stay in the facts. It's really comfortable. It's really easy. It's not hard. I don't have to expose a lot. But yet if you never go into the I hurt, this is who I am, like this really hurt me when you said, or when you didn't notice this, I was really, really hurt. So the other pitfall is I would say, Caleb, that most marriage and family therapists would not say, you know, you don't have to stay in the this is who I am all the time. Like Arlen doesn't come home from work through the door and this is who I am. And I don't like we don't instantly have these deep conversations, right? You don't have to stay in there. But the pitfall is if I never move there,
Yeah.
we never understand what our spouse's true hurt is. And we never get like, wow, that really hurt them. And this is why. One of their weaknesses, one of their flaws, one thing they're working through is
Mhm.
this. And so that's just a pitfall. I think potentially, if we're not careful, it's just easy to be in that upper level, right? It's so comfortable, it's so nuanced, it just happens. That's life. But if we never kind of push ourselves, that deeper connection, that exposure is not going to be there in the know.
Mhm.
Yeah. So push that another level of question or whatever it is. I mean, some of us, I mean, and this is also part of knowing your spouse. Scripture says, dwell with your wife according to knowledge. You know, can your spouse quickly go into these deeper areas, or do they need time? Like, as part of this knowing process, knowing that if we need to process through some things, but we need to schedule it. It's not going to just happen quickly.
Schedule sharing your hurt. Yes.
Yeah.
Schedule
Versus,
sharing,
I
yes.
mean, which sounds kind of funny, but that is part of what could be, versus other couples maybe have a little bit different dynamic, but that's the idea.
Yeah.
Are we willing to have a balance of knowing in these different places and that discovery that goes along with it? I think.
Yeah. For sure. Yep, Arlen, as you're talking about this, it's like honoring. I mean, part of walking into this and increased vulnerability, and we'll get to the other factors of safety and things like that, but it's you can't like force knowing, right? It's not like,
Yeah.
okay, let's sit down and we're going to have this right now, but rather being intentional about creating a space with these other characteristics of safety so that knowing can happen and occur, and you're intentional about
Yeah.
doing
Right.
that. Yeah.
I really appreciate that. And we thought about making these almost a progression, like which one's first, which one's second. But the more that we talked about it, it's that circle, because
Yeah,
all of
it's
them
more overlapping.
build on each other and overlap, like Katie said at the beginning. But you can see why knowing is really important of vulnerability. But there's things that have to happen for knowing to even take place. So let's go into another one and kind of flesh that out a little bit. So the second topic here is trust, right? So, and you can imagine it's going to be hard to know someone if there's not a trust level. How well do you trust your spouse? The opposite being this idea of being unsure or having a level of doubt, or maybe being skeptical. Don't quite know how someone might respond or that kind of a thing. So speaking to this trust, Katie, you go first this time. Why is trust important for vulnerability?
Yeah, trust is super important for vulnerability. If you think of, I think when we take our marriage vows, we trust our spouse will commit to that vow, and likewise, our spouse trusts we would commit to the same vow. And so that reliance, or that hope, confident hope or expectation, is the definition actually of trust. To show or allow your weaknesses and flaws to be known and seen takes an incredible amount of trust, and it's an exposure of a whole new level. Like at the beginning of engagement, or when you were single, there was a lot of things that your potential forever roommate did not know, right? And you kind of kept those hidden. And yet once you enter into that covenantal relationship, there's a level of exposure and a depth there that it's really, really, it's hard and it's difficult. And so thinking about trust, and then the opposite, the unsurety or doubt. Sometimes it's not about that covenantal vow, right? I trust my spouse will keep the vow. My spouse keeps the vow, and so forth. But it's more about just, wow, I'm about to share hard. I wonder what will happen if I share that, or
What will their reaction be?
Absolutely. Last time I shared that, I trusted them with those emotions, or I trusted them with something kind of scary. It didn't go so well.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of doubtful. I'm kind of skeptical about the trust and the emotional or the connection piece, not necessarily keeping my vow to my marriage relationship. So I would say for purpose here today in vulnerability and marriage with the trust piece, it's not necessarily the vow piece of marriage. It's more that heart and that emotional attachment with trust.
Yeah. Caleb, speak into this a little bit. What would you say when you think about this idea of trust? What kind of comes to your mind?
Yeah. So as Katie was sharing there, there's a couple aspects of trust. And so the one is like, oh, is my spouse, are they a person that I can trust as far as trustworthy? Meaning you as
dependable.
Dependable. But there's another aspect though of trust that is, are they really interested in me specifically? Do I matter? Like when they live life, when they schedule, do they have me in their mind? Right? Do I matter to them? Am I part of, and that's another part of trust, I think that Katie, you're really referring to in this sense of vulnerability is, in order for vulnerability to this kind of back and forth to deepen, there needs to be that aspect. I mean, both are true, but the second, certainly we're assuming the first is true. The second is critical for vulnerability.
Let's go into this. We call it a triangle of trust. Again, not exhaustive, but just some things to think about in what makes up trust, or how do we get to this place of trust. And again, maybe it's not, they don't necessarily build on each other. They're just presented this way, but I think they're important aspects to get us this place of where we feel like we're on the same team. And so there's this love piece at the bottom that we have, how can I love today? Katie, walk into that. What does that mean? Like how do we think about love in the context of trust?
Yeah, so I would say on the pieces here, if you do start at the bottom, the love piece, honestly, when you think of scripture and what love means, it comes back to just like not self-serving and serving others. I remember when Arlen and I got married, some of the best wisdom we were given was just the concept of how can wake up and not think about yourself. Wake up and think, how can I outserve my spouse today? And actually, we've passed out serving my spouse. We've passed that along to several different people over the years, and it does still ring true today. Because when I wake up, I'm thinking of myself, my schedule, my needs, my energy, all of those pieces. And so for vulnerability, for trust to be there, I have to trust not only that we're on the same team, which is the together piece of this component, but just that I'm out serving my spouse today. And what does that look like? Listening is a key piece. Am I listening to listen? Am I listening to respond? Am I listening to fix? What am I listening with that communication piece? How can I stop what I'm doing? Maybe communicate. Now is not a good time. I'm free in a few minutes. Like, how can I best prepare myself to listen to what they're about to say? Sure. That speaks to what Caleb was saying about the dependability and the willingness to, I actually do care, which is the empathy piece there. How can I put myself in their shoes? How can I think about, I know how my day has gone. Do I care about how their day has gone, and maybe their reaction and their words and how that all plays in together with vulnerability and trust? So again, maybe the triangle is not the exact graphic, but there's definitely components here that are super, super important for trust to be evident, and then obviously towards vulnerability.
Let me back up and then flesh this out just a little bit more. Something you said there kind of caught me there, Kate. So when you think about loving, how can I love today? It's really about almost like that love language conversation, that love language idea, right? Do I know, again, tying into do I know what my spouse needs right now to feel loved? And am I willing to engage in that to help her or him feel loved? Is it, do they need acts of service right now? Do they need quality time right now? How can I put them first there? And then Caleb, speak a little bit more to this listening and empathy side here. Those kind of tie together, I'm guessing, but listening is so important, as Katie said. How do you know if you're a good listener? How do you know if you're listening? Teach us right here.
Your wife will, or your husband or wife will let you know.
They'll usually let you know that. Yeah, okay, so that's the answer.
You're not listening when, and you're listening now. There you go.
But I like the question and the way that that you, Katie and Erlen, even asked this question here. How best can I prepare myself to listen? Because it's convicting to me when I think about one of the challenges I have is, transitioning from work to being present with Ange. And part of active listening is first listening to my own body and my own heart to be able to get to a place that I'm responsive and with her, right? Because it's difficult to be a good listener if, and I'm still churning on things. And so it's a both, okay, listening to be able to be at a place to listen, and then actively hearing what my spouse is saying, not just we would say in words, but what's the message? Is she saying this with what tone of voice? Does she have a tear in her eye? All of those things are important aspects.
I would say too, for the listening piece, listening is communication, right? So listening, there's two pieces of listening. There's the listener and the talker, right? So if there's things that are, location, lots of times, if we're trying to talk in different rooms, generally for our marriage, I'm not gonna lie, but we do it all the time because we're
start
we're
a conversation and walk in the other room, and then
I have to run water because I'm doing dishes or I'm right. Like, so think about location, think about timing, best preparing yourself to listen. Like if there's going to be I'm about to share something that I really need you to hear, doing dishes, kids getting out the door, timing, location, is a big piece of that communication and listening.
I mean, and sometimes to build on that point, I mean, sometimes it seems like, oh, that's an overly simple point, right? The idea that you don't ask a question, walk in the other room. And yet how often, if you just think about your behavior, how often do we do that? And how often do we not capture the little filters that make things harder? And it's just a good check to think about.
Well, it's a good check, and it grinds on a marriage, right? All those little things build up to the frustration or the
little
not
foxes,
being
as Song of Solomon calls them,
the little foxes. That's right.
Yeah.
So it doesn't help me empathize. It doesn't help me feel like we're together and we're in, we're Team Miller in this marriage type of deal.
Yeah.
Caleb, speak about empathy then. So I'm guessing you have to listen well to be able to be empathetic. What does empathy look like, or what would that?
Yeah.
How would you describe that in
there's
two sentences?
2 sentences.
Well, maybe that's not possible. Okay. So just describe it. We'll take time.
Well, this is a really neat thing, Arlen, just that our brains have the capacity to resonate with each other, to feel with each other deeply. We are moved by others being moved. We talk, scripture, Romans talks about weeping with those who weep and rejoicing with those who rejoice. And God has created our brain to not just understand cognitively, but feel. Like when my wife is sad, I can feel sad with her, right? I experience that same kind of emotion, not to the point that then obviously that brings up something in me that I need to walk through, right? The feeling of sadness and how I approach that. But I think with empathy, there's a deep resonating kind of back and forth connection that happens because of the way that God has created our brains and our bodies.
It's maybe not taking on that sadness, but it's sharing in. And I think there is a difference in that wording.
Right. Yes. Yes. Yep. Yeah, the difference between sympathy versus empathy. Right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So at the top here, we have this idea of being together, or how do I communicate that I'm on the same team? Again, almost being very, very purposeful in communicating that. I'll share one example. I just had a conversation a couple of days ago with a leadership couple in our church. And they were talking about, and they described it very vividly. They said there's times in our life, they wanted to keep the joy that they were experiencing. And there's times in their life where they've been very intentional about not facing each other when they're having maybe something going on, but standing side by side, because even that body posture of standing side by side communicates and says, we are on the same team with the same intents together versus against each other. Right? I mean, so again, maybe a little thing, but it helps us remind ourselves of that phrase and then that mindset that goes along with that, teamwork versus competition in any way, shape, or form. Any other thoughts about this idea and trust? And then we'll go on to the next one.
that top piece there, the together piece, I think is really important, because oftentimes I feel like Satan can just run havoc. Like he can turn it to like our spouse is the enemy, our spouse, doesn't want the best for me, our spouse doesn't care, all of those pieces. And so continually using words, continually praying for your spouse communicates in so many ways that you are on the same team in this marriage, and that you are together in that that piece. So just not realizing maybe what does that look like for my marriage. I don't know what being together on the same team means, but the opposite of that, I think oftentimes our sin nature in marriage, we can very quickly fall into that trap.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's go on to the next one here and then think about the next topic here. So safety becomes our third topic here. Okay. So knowing, trusting, and now safety. How do you have safety with your spouse? I think the opposite here is important. We can talk about physical safety. That is an important aspect. Obviously, that's going to be a huge issue if there's against trust and that kind of thing, if there's not a sense of physical safety. But let's go into this level of just even neglect, right? The opposite of safety can be defined, I think rightfully defined, as neglect or feeling neglected. Do I feel safe? Do I almost feel treasured or respected or appreciated by my spouse? Or do I feel neglected? And what does that look like? And obviously those have impacts upon vulnerability. Caleb, we'll go to you. Speak into this. Like, how does safety impact vulnerability?
Mm-hmm. So you think about vulnerability, stepping into and sharing, our weakness, as Katie talked about earlier. Inherently, that brings up fears. It brings up in us, in our bodies, the feeling of fear or, and so with that, there does need to be a level of safety, meaning there is a presence and a being with to be able to open up in a way that you receive your spouse, you're received by your spouse, right? And so that's and by the way, this isn't safe or unsafe, right? It's more about the level of safety that we have, and more we're moving towards what are the things that I'm doing that lead and to conclude, oh, it may not be safe to open up and share this hurt right now, and I don't even know it, right? Or vice versa. And so safety is a critical component to ongoing deepening vulnerability.
Katie, any thoughts about this as you kind of think about this topic of safety?
Yeah, kind of like you mentioned, Arlene, there's definitely a physical component to safety. We don't want to negate that, but I would say safety in most marriages, there's just, I hear often marriages say, we're not that, that's not our marriage. That's not our kind of marriage. We don't talk about that. We're not like that. We just can't get there in our marriage. That's just not who we are. And I do wonder sometimes if there's not that level of, if you do feel one spouse feels, maybe neglected, not as important, taken for granted, utilitarian in many ways, depending upon what part of marriage and season of marriage they're in. I think those safety pieces, do I make my spouse feel precious? Do I make my spouse feel special? Do I allow my spouse the ability to, share something? The Psalm 78:53, I love that verse. It talks about the word safety in that verse, and scripture doesn't say exactly what safety is there, but it says what it's not. So they feared not is what 78:53 says. And I love that they feared, like, I can open up again. I do feel special. I do feel loved and cared for in an emotional way. So,
yeah.
And go ahead.
That really ties in. I just want to jump into this question because that has a great visual, I think, that goes with this idea of walls, right? Why do we build walls? We build walls to often keep us safe, or at least that's what you think. Keep bad things out and good things in, kind of leads towards a wall. And in this context, we're talking about walls being not healthy things. a person, because they are feeling maybe neglected or not valued or not appreciated or have a level of fear, there's a wall that can go up. And so now there's a little bit of introspective work here in marriages. Are there walls? That's a conversation starter. Are there walls within our marriage? And how do we think about those walls? Thoughts as you just think about this idea of a concept of walls that can be built.
Mhm. Well, so a couple thoughts, Arlen. One is initially, in some ways, I would say putting up a wall increases my safety. Does that make sense? But
Yeah.
I like it says as a couple. So I think with that, what the whole idea of safety relationally, because part of what we do, I think at times, is put up walls so that we feel more safe within ourselves. And so part of safety as a relationship is us as spouses being able to sit with the uncomfortable emotions that come up with us, that feel unsafe to us, perhaps, that feel uncomfortable, that I can be with the vulnerability of my spouse.
Yeah. Walls personally are different than what God created for marriage and walls relationally, right? Is that what you're saying there, Caleb? Yeah.
Yeah, that sometimes the walls that I might put up that are more about me sitting with my spouse with fear, and I feel helpless, and so I start putting up walls within myself by either trying to fix or moving away from her because I feel unsafe about the emotion, not about her. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so I think it's a both and, again, of both. How do we move towards safety within our own selves as these things come up? And also, because I think that influences how I sit with my spouse in a safe way.
Well, and it influences future walls potentially. So if you have a conversation and one spouse shares a hard or a difficult and it wasn't taken well, boop, up goes a wall, right? We're not doing that again. That was hard.
Yes.
But now, was that hard relationally, or was that hard because personally I felt really, really hurt, or personally they didn't get, there is that the difference between the individual and the relational, but encouraging like that turning towards, which I think we'll get to in the next characteristic here, would speak to that. So that's a good point there, Caleb, that I hadn't thought about, that whether it's the individual reflection or the relational reflection.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing too, and I think there's an aspect here. I mean, sometimes there's an incident that causes a rift, that causes a wall to go up, like you just shared, Katie, right? So I'm not going back to that place because that was really hard and uncomfortable and was not good. But then I think there's also a wall that kind of develops over time through that neglect piece where, why should I even try? Because over time, there's just been no demonstration of openness or value or safety or caring. We just slowly start to live our lives. I mean, you hear about that concept of like, well, we're just two people living in the same house, kind of our own individual lives. And so how do we break down those walls, or at least identify those walls, to say, we want to step into a place of safety. We want to step into a place where we can have sharing and back and forth. Any thoughts on that, or how does that stir any thoughts? I guess, Caleb, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, yep, that's good. So I think initially, even if we're able to start with that conversation, Arlen, that, I notice within myself when we step into this topic, I start to become defensive, or a wall comes up for me. So I'm taking personal responsibility, but also expressing the desire to continue to learn ways to little by little, break down that wall. And so I think even beginning with acknowledging that it's there. Let's talk about the fact that it's there is a good place to start.
That's a great point too, Caleb. Our physiology, I bet spouses that know each other well, I would say, they know their spouse's physiological response when things get really hard.
The look, is that what you're saying? The look, they know the look.
Maybe it's a look, I'm not going to say, or not. Maybe it's like a nervous tick. Maybe it's like a sway, right? Like a tight smile, right? There's a
They
lot
get
of
busy
things.
and
And
start cleaning the whole house. Yeah.
yeah, we won't say if that may or may not have happened. Right. So that's a fascinating introspective question though. Like, do you know your spouse's nervous, like physiological response when you can't sit in that hard where that wall continues to grow? I bet a lot of your spouse and vice versa would be able to share that. That's a great way to start. Like, I noticed.
Yeah.
Here's
Yeah.
mine,
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's go on to the fourth one here. I think this is an important one, and you can see these first three really tie together well. I think they're all kind of maybe aspects of it: knowing, trusting, being safe. Now here, this one becomes maybe a little bit how. Okay, a little bit different than what. It's more of a how. Consistency. How do we get to a place of vulnerability? It's by being consistent. By creating almost a little bit of a pattern, the opposite being haphazard or random. The definition there of consistent being this idea that we're gonna just be steady. We're gonna be steady and intentional about this idea, and see where that goes. So, Katie, you first this time. How is consistency important to vulnerability?
I think when most of us would have gotten married however many years ago, many people would have given us the wisdom, marriage is great and marriage is hard. And we like to focus on that first one, marriage is great, and kind of thought, well, I don't know marriage is hard yet because marriage is marriage, right? And yet I wonder if those same people would tell you marriage is hard, but here's a couple things to think about. Consistency is a big, big one. Repeatedly, in order to be vulnerable, repeatedly turning towards your spouse, repeatedly realizing you're not going to get it right, and consistently trying again and saying, you know what, okay, that didn't go well, and we learned this, now let's go forward, and trying again, right? Marriage is not about getting and conquering that checklist. Marriage is about learning and the journey of it. And so assuming good intent consistently, good marriages don't just happen is a great quote with this. Good marriages just don't happen. Arlen, you have a great example of a puzzle that you've given before.
The example I've used before is like sometimes I think we think our marriage is going to be perfect. It's similar idea that if you just took like 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and just dumped it out on the table and expected it all to come together perfectly, right? I mean, that doesn't happen, right? I mean, to do that, it takes intentional effort. It takes a consistent, persistent approach. And I think there's something here to that. We have to do the work if we want to have a good marriage. Caleb, you've seen this a lot, probably. Speak into it just for a little bit from your experience, or any thoughts you might have.
Well, one thought I have is, just as you were talking, Arlen and Katie, is our vows commit to this through riches or poor, through, health or sickness, is like this saying, there is going to be a consistency of me being with you through life, regardless what happens. And I think that creates stability in the relationship. And I think what you're alluding to, I think as well, Katie, is these are small moments that we're present with each other. I mean, they could be moments of parting when we leave for the day and when we, come home at the end of the day. But there is something that we come to look forward to of a time that we're kind of together. And so it's
If you ask, it's interesting, if you'd ask most couples, like, what do you consistently do? They're like, oh, we're just so spontaneous, we don't schedule, so, they kind of might hem-haw around. But yet when you ask them, if your spouse is gone for a couple of days on a work trip or whatnot, you start to notice those consistent things, whether it's the prayer before bedtime or the kiss when you walk in the door. Like, you start to notice, like, oh, I guess actually those small, consistent connecting pieces I do actually miss when, my spouse is gone. So obviously, for trust, for vulnerability, for those pieces, consistently considering your marriage, where you're at, the relationship, it's not random. Like, good marriages just don't happen.
I ran into this quote, which I really like just not that long ago. It says different context, but I think it fits here. Relationships are built or destroyed one conversation at a time, one action or lack of action at a time, right? It's that idea that the relationships either are being built or they're being destroyed by the actions that we do day in and day out. Like I would argue, Katie, that everybody has patterns. Everybody has behavior they engage in. Most of us do pretty much the same thing every morning when we get up, whether it's, brush our teeth or whatever it might be. There's a pattern to our behavior. And I think with our marriages, it's important to think about what are the patterns that we are developing and how are they impacting our relationship.
Yeah, it makes me think of it. Another doctor's lesson, Leslie Parrott, they've written a book, and they're therapists and believers. They mention to premarital couples and early in their marriage, choose your ruts wisely, right?
Yeah.
This whole idea, Arlen, that we get into patterns, routines over time. What is it that what pattern, right? Or discipline do you want to be?
Ruts in and of themselves aren't bad, just choosing the right one.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So let me use one more example here, and then we'll kind of move towards a close and leave some time for questions if there's any questions. But I was challenged once by a mentor of mine to say, we kind of get into this vacation mindset with things where it's like, okay, we work, and then we have a vacation, and we expect those 1 to 2 weeks or whatever we take for a vacation to kind of solve everything. And then we work, and we get to a vacation, right? And it puts a lot of pressure on that time to be okay, or this becomes our getaway as a couple. And in these 3 days, we're going to solve 9 months of stress. And then we wonder why
or you
we get
could
back
do it like every 3 months and then, just throw that out there.
So their challenge was like, can you build a daily respite into your life? Can you build daily consistent routines where you have a level of connection or a level of vulnerability or a level of getting back together on a regular basis? And what could that look like? Withdrawal is good and necessary, and you still need those other times, but don't wait for them to begin to be building actions that are building up your relationship on a daily level. I think it has blessed me to kind of shift my thinking a little bit in certain things.
It takes the pressure off of that vacation mode mindset, but it also encourages alleviating the pressure during the regular day of life. We all can't go on vacation all the time, right? There's still the daily need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other questions or thoughts on this, or let's move to our final slide if not. So just to kind of summarize here, we have this same graphic we started with. You've got these 4 different aspects: know, trust, safety, consistency, but then you have the converse within them. So help us put this all together, or just any thoughts. Katie, you go first, and Caleb, you can wrap it up. Any thoughts to consider for couples as we try to think about vulnerability in this context?
Yeah, I would say, again, these are just 4 components. It's not an all-inclusive list. There's many more out there, I'm sure, for true vulnerability and so forth. But I'd say, whether you've joined us online or you listen to this in the future, there's going to be one area that you and your spouse are probably really strong in. As we talked through this material, you're like, yeah, I get that. We got that one. And then there's potentially another area or 2 where you're like, ooh, that's really hard for our marriage. I don't know. That seems kind of difficult. So I would just encourage you in the strong areas of vulnerability, continue to grow those. And then in the areas that you're not quite comfortable with, is there one, point going forward that you can be like, okay, we've tried it, we need to try again, and just encourage you in that. Arlen may cringe, but one of my favorite quotes is from a fairy tale. And this quote says this: the greatest risk any of us may take is to be seen as we truly are. The greatest risk any of us may take is to be seen as we truly are. In a healthy, vibrant marriage, vulnerability is a key to that, to be seen as we truly are, and not just seen, but loved in a God-honoring way. That's special. That's very special.
Caleb, any thoughts? And then we'll go to questions from anyone after that point.
I guess a thought I have is this journey for all of us is both really exciting and scary. And I think acknowledging the beauty of merit as we walk through this kind of journey together, it's not like, oh, we've arrived at knowing or trust or, vulnerability, but it's an ongoing deepening. And I think the beauty of it is that just in our relationship with Christ, the idea is transformation of ourselves and our relationship. And I think, that's really what this is all about, is transformation at the core of who we are, not just how we speak, but the very desires that we have are being changed, right? And so I think
I appreciate that. I really do. If anyone has a question, if this stirred anybody's mind or thoughts, please feel free to unmute your mics, ask a question. Just be mindful we are recorded, so I'm asking you to keep your cameras off unless you're comfortable having your face show up on the screen. But if there's any questions out there that this is stirred, please, this would be a great time to ask them. We'd be glad to talk them through. Caleb gets the hard questions. We get the easy questions. That's always the agreement. If not, I'll bring this to a close. Really appreciate the conversation and the discussion that's taken place so far. And the visual that always comes to my mind in this setting is just that idea of going from the shallow end to the deeper end. You might have a child, you maybe watched kids kind of learn how to swim, and at some point it's appropriate and fine for them to be in the shallow end and just kind of splash around. But over time, there's a depth that's expected, and figuring out how to kind of walk into that in a gentle way and walk in that together. The opportunity that's in front of us is to know each other well, that connection, that deeper level of connection, where we don't have to hide or feel ashamed, but together as a team, we can approach life. And hopefully some of the things that were shared, examples that were shared, some of these principles, they maybe can help us as we take that step as couples from shallow end to deeper ends of vulnerability. So God bless you as you walk into those places, and may you do it with his love and grace. Thanks, Caleb. Thanks, Katie, for joining today. And thank each one of you for being part of us.